It's the Wonkhe Show. What Donald Trump has got to do with the ref is where we start this week, and along the way we discuss equality and diversity, the sector's submissions to the spending review, and what's going on with apprenticeships and the wider skills agenda. It's all coming up.
We can't simultaneously have lower corporate tax rates and greater public tax expenditure on increasing the potential of their employees. So we can't, the maths won't add up.
Welcome back to the Wonkhe Show, your weekly way into this week's higher education, news, policy and analysis. I'm your host, Mark Leach, and joining me for another high-level policy chat this week, we have three fantastic guests as always. In his office at King's, Shitij Kapur, Vice Chancellor and President at King's College London. Shitij, your highlight of the week, please.
Well, what have I been watching this week? I think, like everyone, one eye is across the Atlantic to see what's going on there. And the other eye is actually on good things happening here. So I don't know if the rest of the sector noticed, but just on Tuesday, there was a big AI release. The DCIT announced the results of their competition. And King's is very fortunate to have won a big award to set up a Centre for AI and Drug Development and Cancer. So that was the good news at home, with a very eye over the waters.
Lovely. In East Yorkshire, it's Jess, Director for Education at Public First. Jess, your highlight of the week, please.
I have two. My personal highlight is the enormous bacon sandwich I'm going to have after this. But my professional highlight is we published this week our commission into countering online conspiracies in schools with the Pears Foundation. It's a culmination of a whole year's worth of work talking to young people and teachers about online conspiracy theories and how to tackle it. And we're delighted that we hope it's going to kind of continue into the future as we sort of track what's going on in the online world. And all I will say, if any parents listening, if you have a read, it might give you some sort of nightmares about your teenager's smartphone use. But yeah, very pleased in the Public First Hours this week.
I'd love to see an HD version of that as well, instantly. When I was a student, there was an awful lot of conspiracy theories about how, what was buried under different buildings on campus and secret tunnels and all the rest. It all goes back to, the Illuminati or whatever. Anyway, and in North London, it's Debbie McVitty, Wonkhe's editor. Debbie, your highlight of the week, please.
Well, I'm going to transparently suck up to Jess and say that my highlight of the week was getting to visit our colleagues at Public First, where we had a really interesting conversation about some projects that we want to work on together, and I think is going to do some really interesting things in the coming months. So that was very invigorating, and also involved drinking a massive amount of coffee, which I'm always here for.
Yes, secret project. So we'll start the week with diversity and all of that. Debbie, what on earth's going on, please?
Well, Shitij mentioned having one eye across the pond, and that, of course, is the context in which a new discussion about diversity, equality and inclusion has erupted on the pages of some of our broadsheet media. So the Times on Saturday led with a headline that, it was a subheader really, but with sort of the idea that in order to be given research funding, universities would have to subscribe to a sort of ideological position around equality, diversity and inclusion. Dig a little deeper and you get to the bottom of this, and what it is commentary on the ongoing discussion about the measurement of the people, culture and environment element of the REF in 2029, and which is very much under discussion at the minute. There's a pilot going on. It's about how do we understand excellence in the people, culture, environment context, of which obviously diversity, equality and inclusion is an element. It's not the only element, but it is an element, and I would argue an important one. And this is sort of being painted as a sort of woke ideologies creeping into our research assessment. On the site, DK has kind of broken down the sort of realities that are driving some of this, but obviously it's being picked up by people who are on an ongoing basis quite invested in making the case that there's too much woke in our public discourse. And the kind of, I guess, the sort of wider worry of the wider context is that when as President Trump kind of cracks down on diversity, equality and inclusion initiatives, and sort of seems to be sort of signalling that no federal funding should be going to this sort of work, there is going to be a knock-on impact on the choices that researching organizations make, on the kind of practice of science. That doing this work will become sort of not only unfashionable but also kind of potentially in the US context quite dangerous for people's careers, and that there could be a sort of ripple effect over here in the UK.
Right. Right. Okay. That's cheery. Shitij, can you just help me out here for a second? Because how does it follow that because Donald Trump and his administration are cracking down on DEI and doing all this and creating a chilling atmosphere for researchers, as Debbie said, why does that spark a conversation in this country about that? Why is this in the Times? Why are we talking about what's happening in the ref because Donald Trump's racist? Genuinely, please help me.
Should that surprise us? It is the most powerful nation in the world. It sets our socio-cultural trends, pretty much in the English-speaking world for sure. So I think it shouldn't surprise us that we will see more of it. But I think we shouldn't overreact. And when I look at the DEI agenda, and look, it's really complex. Personally, it appears to me that there are some things that are uncontroversial that most people would subscribe to. And then there is an increasing spectrum of what you might say, what becomes socio-political or frankly just political or ideological. So let's start from the one end. And I think all of us would agree about equality of opportunity. You'd really have to be living in the Middle Ages if you think that some demographic should privilege some people to opportunity. So I think everyone would say that the level of the hurdle should be the same for everyone, regardless of race and demographic. So equality in its strictest sense, no one would disagree. Now then it gets more complicated when you get to equity, because the simple way that I explain it to people is that that's when you start changing the bar, depending upon how tall your legs are. Now, that's where some people think, should you really change the bar? But some people would very reasonably argue that if you're being fair, it isn't fair to ask someone with short legs to jump the same hurdle. I'm just taking a very simple metaphor. What becomes, frankly, really problematic is when you go for equality of outcomes. And I think that's the spectrum of DEI. And then there are some things that are at any point in time caught in the current socio-political discourse, and that's where you get onto the woke end of things. And for the moment, rightly or wrongly, be fair to say that the transgender gender debate is very much in the crosshairs of a lot of people. So I think it depends where on the spectrum. Now, coming back to the Times article and ref, which is a very practical, realistic thing, I think the headline was a little bit overarching. Anyone who would go in and look through what the ref panel is proposing would find that in the 25%, which is in the sort of, culture environment category, 20% of it is the sensible things most people would agree, that you want to train your researchers in ethics. I would like to see someone stand up and saying, no, that you need to have a strategy of how people are approaching the development of, trainees. I think then there is, when you get into this equity, equality part of it, which is just 5% of it, that's where it gets probably contentious.
Seeing all the different commentators pile on this is also interesting. There's a piece from Eric Hoffman from Buckingham University this week where he's sort of saying, oh, well, I guess this is all brilliant. Obviously, what's happening in America, down with all the, the woke ref panels. Let's hope that, reform is going to come and, save us at the next election and do something similar that Donald Trump is doing in America. And given the state of where the polls are, do you see that as actually something that's quite likely?
So I think what's really interesting about this is back in 2022, we did a piece of research where we looked at sort of universities as a partisan issue, and we compared the US and the UK. You look at the US, there's a real political line split. Essentially, to boil it down to, if you vote Republican, you don't like universities, you don't trust them, you don't think they should be funded. If you vote Democrat, you're the opposite. You love them, you think there should be more of them, you think they should get more public funding. In the UK, 2-3 years ago, there wasn't that political partisan split. Labour voters and Conservative voters, there was a few differences. Labour tended to be slightly more positive, but it wasn't the case that sort of voters on the right were as negative as voters on the right in America. And that's partly because the political culture in America had split, and the polarization was way more dynamic than it was in the UK. And that's only sort of accelerated over the last few years. I would love to do that study again now, because I don't know what the answer would be. My sense is those splits in the UK would be wider than they were a few years ago, but I don't know how wide. And what I think is really interesting, to come back to the discussion over the ref, is that some of this is just about I feel like it's about the language that academics and institutions become really comfortable using that makes them sort of an easy thing to attack, right? Like my reading of the people, culture, environment measure, as someone who tries as much as possible to avoid thinking about the ref too hard, because I don't work for university and I don't have to, is that is a bit of, measuring the wider impact of research outside the sort of pure academic output. What else is your research doing? How is it impacting people around you? It's a very sort of civic-minded thing about which we like. But we fall into the trap of using this sort of language of equity, this language of sort of equality and DEI that is a little bit alienating. And essentially you sort of make yourself an Easy Times headline accidentally. And so to come back to the sort of Eric Kaufman reform thing, like, I don't know if we'll see a reform government in 2030. I don't think that's likely. I do think we see a lot more reform seats. And I do think you see a lot of more political pressure from the right to, do things and to tackle these sorts of topics. And I guess the challenge for the sector is just to avoid sort of walking into the enormous bear trap that people keep leaving for them, or sort of stepping on a series of rakes.
But is it a bear trap, or is it just, common sense and what's right? So, I mean, I just don't understand this. We're meant to talk less about equity because some people are racist. I think screw those people. I mean, what's the point of having a higher education system in a liberal democracy? And reform's going to pick up, 3 or 4 seats. I can just see it now. All the, everyone being like, oh, wow, it's really important. We respect those right-wing voters. We mustn't be talking anymore about equity because, some people voted for reform and are a little bit racist. I mean, I don't get it.
I don't think I would put it in, you've sort of polarized it. So you see, for me as a university vice chancellor, what is really critical is that we are seen as institutions where all the country, regardless of its political views, is comfortable with their children going. If we get seen as the bastion of either the left or the right, we have lost our public mandate. So I think it is very critical that universities not find themselves sort of shoehorned as a bastion of something because it necessarily excludes. We're talking about inclusivity here. Inclusivity is everyone. So now that doesn't mean that you don't have any principles. That doesn't mean that anything goes. But I think it does put a responsibility on us that we are open. And so what does that actually mean? There's a beautiful article, I think it is in November in the Financial Times by Yanan Ganesh. And I think the title of it was Liberals Speak a Different Language. And as Jess was saying, sometimes it's the words we use because we who've gone to the university feel comfortable with their words. Everyone else who's gone to the university understands those words. They mean something, sometimes often benign, but to the rest of the world, and mind you, at this point in time in the UK, majority of our citizens have not gone to the university. So for them, it's exclusionary. So I'm purposely using the language of DEI to say we need to be inclusive of those people. That doesn't mean anything else.
Debbie, help me. I massively respect that position, and this is why I don't have to run a university, so I can make the rules about what my company does and doesn't do, thankfully, without always political bear traps. But there's such a part of me that makes me think, well, we've got to win the arguments. These people are wrong. Why do we have to give them anything? Debbie, please.
This is sort of what I was trying to work through in a piece I did for the site, which is sort of thinking about, because I think that there's two bear traps here for the sector. I think one is to kind of stay quiet and go, well, this is all just sort of heat and noise and Donald Trump, and we'll just sort of quietly keep things moving forward here. The other is, I think perhaps where your temptation is, Mark, to really react, to kind of to sort of take a side to and to engage in a kind of in a framing of the debate as being a polarizing one, which again is sort of exactly what the sort of the anti-woke people kind of want. And I think the thing that I sort of regret is that the nature of the way the political debate is, it sort of drags the conversation into that kind of populist right space, which I think always has appeal because it provides easy answers and kind of lets you get away with kind of category slippage and all that sort of stuff. It has that kind of broad appeal, but actually it's not where most people's heads are. Should you say I think it is hard to disagree that any society that kind of is interested in justice and human experience isn't going to look at and think about equality, diversity, and inclusion, although they might not think of frame it in exactly that way. And actually Wes Streeting was interviewed and reported in The Guardian, and he's sort of saying, look, I could get a lot of immediate kind of good feedback if I cancelled all the EDI initiatives in the NHS, but actually let's look at the impact of anti-bullying initiatives and anti-racist initiatives for nurses working on the wards. These are real people who are kind of facing these things every day, and I think most people agree that they shouldn't have to, and we should make sure and that has bad outcomes in terms of everyone's the public health, because you have people doing a bad job. I would argue that universities should be making the case with evidence in a reasoned way to say, well, how do we talk about the way that we deliver this in a way that feels that is evidence based in terms of actually what impact does it have on research excellence if universities are embracing EDI initiatives in their research culture. What should those initiatives look like? Just saying we've signed up to this thing, or we do that thing, we have a mentoring program. Well, actually, are you evidencing that? And I think one of the things that public policy can do is to say, well, show me the evidence, show me that it works, show me why it contributes to that broader excellence agenda. And I personally am very persuaded by the idea that if we have diversity of researchers, we get a much better research output, we get much better impact, because you have people who have different experiences that they bring to the choices they make. They have different, and so on and so forth. So I disagree that that this has nothing to do with research excellence. But yes, I want to see the evidence, and that's where universities need to sit. They need to sit in that evidence space that says, let us talk about this as a whole society in a way that allows us to that is evidence informed and evidence led. And we can decide together what the best way to approach this is. Let's listen to the people who have this experience. Let's listen to the experts and bring these things together, and not kind of just take sides and shout at each other.
Well, I think what we need and what seems missing at the minute is some sort of combination of that robust response that you and Mark and Debbie and Shitij have just given, which is like, if we really believe this is the right thing to do, show the evidence and stand up and say it. I think the sector's instinct, and maybe it's just because of the diversity and the lack of a sort of a leader or spokesperson that can every time there's a story in the media, you don't have just one person who can stand up and say
history business
and we're right.
Yeah.
And in the absence of that, you just get silence. You just get people saying that this agenda is wrong, and universities quietly to themselves saying, well, we're not wrong, it's those people that are wrong. And I think what we need is, again, if you really genuinely believe that this is the right thing to do, someone needs to stand behind it fairly robustly and explain why, because this sort of wave of criticism about equality, diversity, inclusion is not going anywhere, and it's cyclical, right? Like, even if it goes in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, this sort of thing will happen again and again. You sort of see it sort of ebb and flow, and I think the best thing for the sector to start to do is think about standing behind its own sort of measures.
To me, there are 2 or 3 things that follow. First, I think that our language in the discussion of these concepts is more divisive than the concepts themselves are to most people. So I think where the universities may have been less careful is that we've created a sort of special language of talking about these things, which excludes other people, but also we've made some words toxic, which sometimes trivializes this. So a lot of efforts go, if you use this word is wrong, and people who do not come from that sort of linguistic spectrum, for a lack of a better word, then feel that we can't even talk right. And I'm just going to, so that's one is, I think very deeply in our society, there is less division about the concept than there is about the language. The second, I think what we as universities and often large corporate institutions need to own, that some of these programs, not all, the evidentiary basis for them is developing. So they have been put in with the best of intention, but we do not as yet know how well they work. Now, in many other domains, you would do it in a stepped fashion. You wouldn't make it, mandatory for everyone before you knew it kind of worked. But I think there was a lot of moral and general force that we needed to do something quickly. And I think we've got to be careful about that. We don't get ahead of the evidence on this. But the last part, and I think, Jess and Debbie, you were right about the fact that there is polarization politically along the university spectrum. In other words, university-going voters vote very differently. It's even, it's again, using one of the special terms, it's even more intersectional than that. University-going women are really at another end of a spectrum from non-university attending men. And I think both in the US and the UK, and I've had the privilege of being also in Canada and Australia, if there is one element of our society that we have collectively thought less of is, and I'll use this term carefully here, is the sort of white working class male who does not go to university. If you now look at university attendance rates, the segment that is lagging is, now working class is a very loose term, but I think you get what, and therefore I know we're going to be talking about apprenticeships later, and I think, David Goodhart's written a very good book about some of these issues, that universities are seen as, no-go places for some segments of our society. So we've got to reflect on that.
Right, let's see who's been blogging for us this week.
Hi, I'm Tom Peru, and I'm a media developer in the digital learning team at the University of the West of England. This week on Wonkhe, I've been blogging about the potential of educational podcasts, and in particular, how they might be a good resource for commuter students. There's a lot to unpick when you think about education on the go, and particularly using an audio-only format. So we take a quick look at ideas like storytelling and authenticity to create something that really resonates with students and keeps their attention. commission. We also touch on some more practical aspects, like how to record, how long it should be, how to support accessibility, and how to best prepare for a natural conversation, alongside a few ideas to get you thinking about the kind of content that you might want to create.
Now, the CSR is looming, so everyone's getting their submissions in. Jess, tell us what's going on, please.
Yes, so the sound of champagne corks popping across the sector on Sunday night was all of the collective public affairs teams pressing send on their spending review bids. Universities UK have published theirs for all of us to see. With nothing in there, I think, that is particularly surprising. So the spending review is obviously the opportunity to ask the government for money in an environment where the government keeps telling us there is no money. So we see some strategic uplifts to the strategic priority grant linked to both the growth and the opportunity mission. There is a call to index link tuition fees sort of as a standard measure. So that just happens automatically. We don't have to have this sort of debate every year about whether they're going to go up or not. There's a call for the government to do something about the teacher pension scheme, committed funding to the training scheme, and a sort of plea from government, I think, for a bit of stability over the next few years so the sector can get its heads down and get on with things. Whether or not that's listened to remains to be seen. It's worth sort of saying that every organisation, big and small across the country, is putting things into the Treasury and asking for money. So, we'll have to wait until June to see whether higher education is a winner or a loser when Rachel Reeves stands up and does her spending review speech.
And what was interesting to me, since you used the metaphor of champagne corks popping, what I saw was all the goblets being swiped from the table with the OB, Office of Budget Responsibility, saying that Rachel Reeves will have 10 billion less than she might have thought. So what I'm really struggling with, and that's where my worry for the sector, is not the benign disposition of the government towards our cause. It's the very limited headroom they have after they have taken care of their sort of, for lack of a better word, mandatory expenses. And look, when I see what's happening around the sector with its own finances, which is as the way things are, and none of us would have missed that even the universities you would have thought, Newcastle, Edinburgh, Cardiff, Durham, which essentially tells you no one is safe.
Yeah, and definitely there's a line in the submission that really stood out to me, which was about a call to sort of sustain vulnerable provision. So, in a spending review as a sector, you lose where things get cut, you stay neutral, you keep the same amount, or you win, you gain some money for things. And I think it's telling that higher education is a place where one of its sort of win criteria is enough money to keep some types of provision going in, places where otherwise that might disappear completely. It doesn't feel like the sort of strongest starting point. And I'm sure it'll be a nervous few months for everyone up in Woburn House, sort of waiting to find out what's going to happen next.
What's not in the spending review, Debbie? I mean, obviously the sector has to ask for more money. That's sort of kind of a pro forma at this point. But we discussed kind of what's the wider environment is obviously incredibly challenging, and there's not enough money. But what else is there?
Yeah, well, I'm sort of thinking about the sort of authenticity of the exercise. Because I read UK submission, and Guild AG have published theirs as well, and they've got some interesting ideas for how the government can spend money. And of course, as Jess said, everyone's going to be pitching this in. I think it sort of seems odd that the exercise is designed around here's all the things you could spend money on, and it's a very workmanlike submission. My kind of instinct, I guess, is that sort of model of being like, oh, it's a spending review, here's how you can spend some money, and here's a sort of nicely worked up kind of justification for why our sector is worth it, and here's a few different things you can spend money on, probably isn't the thing that is needed in this fiscal environment. And actually really what the sector should be looking at is something more akin to a kind of business case. If you invest X and we will do the following and we will return Y. So I mean, I think, and there's stuff in there. So for example, the conversation about a transformation fund has been ongoing. It acknowledges two things. One is that the sector is kind of the sort of the business model of the sector currently, and this sort of cuts across most institutions, is under an awful lot of strain, which is causing institutions to make decisions about what they can continue to offer. That then has consequences, both in terms of the availability of provision, the institutional stability, but also the sorts of transformation that institutions might wish to undertake can cost money. It can, and having a transformation fund could help to enable some of those shifts to be done in a more sort of organised way, in a way that kind of takes a kind of public economic value that actually creates a more sustainable kind of long-term situation for various institutions. But I think simply just, at this point, it feels wrong to me, but that might just be how this is done. To be saying, here's a nice thing that you should be investing in. Let's invest a bit more in access. Let's invest a bit more in sector transformation. Really kind of setting out what that looks like, and what the kind of estimated returns would be. I think would be a sort of more compelling thing to do. Some of this, of course, would be hard to do. It would be a lot harder to do, and it would require picking things and saying, if you're going to spend money on one thing, let's make it this, or indeed, sort of particular thing about high cost courses. So there's another particular thing about research and innovation, asking for a bit of everything and hoping for something somewhere.
Debbie, the answer about the business case is very simple, and the answer is always 9. For every pound you invest, the return is 9, and then you can fill in what you are. I mean, I
think you're asking for.
yeah, I am struck by how universal this kind of accounting has become, because everyone manages to come up with 7 or 9 to this. Because
Universities UK managed 14. So
there we go.
Maybe even.
And I'll tell you why that accounting is good, because we count all the externalities, but then so does everyone else also count all the externalities. And to some people, universities are the externalities, where to us, we are the primary driver. Everything else is the externality. Now, when you do it at a national level, if we were getting a 1 in 14 return, we wouldn't be in the soup that we are. We are not getting productivity growth. So look, we have done what every other sector would do. I see in some sense, your concern about the exercise. It is called the spending review. So everyone is trying to see how can we get the government to spend for our cause. But my sense is if universities do not get a favorable upside settlement, then more of the same is just not possible. So then we would have to seriously engage in structural reform. And I mean structural. Something no one would palate at this point in time, because it's even more painful than where we find ourselves. But the point is, if there is no more money, we'll have a choice of either structural reform or decline by attrition. And I hope at that point in time, the sector and the ministers will engage very seriously to avoid decline by attrition. But I don't think it'll happen until everyone's wish list has been dealt with in the CSR.
And there is, I think, it's that kind of what happens next, because there'll be the CSR, there'll be the HE reform package, which, the sort of size and scope of which is a bit sort of unknown at the minute, but it could be something as small as saying, okay, well, we're going to look at graduate repayments and kind of, do a bit of twiddling. Or it could be something a bit more kind of like, right, well, we've got our priorities around efficiency and access and quality and civic and economic growth, and we want to kind of do work in each of those spaces, and that's what this looks like. And I think, one of the things we won't see from the CSR per se is that kind of broader agenda for the future. It's going to be do the CSR and then kind of say, right, well, where have universities landed in this? Okay, what do we then need to do, in policy terms to create that sustainability, if such a thing is even possible?
And I think one of the difficulties for this and why it feels a little bit existential is that what this CSR will do is essentially set the spending envelope for DFE, for DSIT, for all the government departments until the end of this parliament. It really is a sort of moment where we will know what the next 3 to 4 to 5 years look like, bar some sort of additional, fairly large political changes. So, a lot of what UK's response is asking for is sort of, set piece long-term funds for different things. There's some in for innovation, there's some in for research, there's the index-linked tuition fees for teaching. You can really see them, they're trying to set up the environment in which there would just be enough money coming in over the next 3, 4, 5 years that you knew was going to be there, that you could deal with the rest. And what I worry about is, they're not even asking for a lot, and it feels quite unlikely. Just partly, again, even today, you've got such a low growth environment, you've got such low headroom. The attitude from the Treasury is that they're deleting lines, not adding lines in. And so I am slightly nervous that, once this decision has been made, it feels a little bit like the axe is falling somewhere. And I think that the sector really has to gear itself up for, as Shitij says, some fairly fundamental changes if things don't sort of land the right way.
And not just our sector here in the UK. I speak to friends in Canada, in Australia, in the US. US, of course, has a different matter going on at the moment, but certainly Canada and Australia, very similar to our position. So you see, the last 30, 40 years, there was continuous productivity growth and more investment in universities. And they thought maybe there was a causality. There was more investment in universities that was leading to the continuous productivity growth. It might have been the other way around, that because the economy was doing well, the government could afford great universities. And in many ways, the great universities might be the prize of a growing economy. We've got to be able to show that they are the cause of the growing economy. Now, to me, at a cognitive and, conceptual level, that just seems obvious. But to show that in a way that convinces someone who has to pay is our challenge.
Hello, it's Jim from the team here with news of our exciting student experience event in March. UKHE has a great reputation, but as the resource envelope tightens, it's not clear that what's been sold to students as a higher education experience can compensate for high costs, overcrowded facilities, and stressed out academic and support staff. The result? Widespread health and well-being issues, stubborn awarding gaps, and the erosion of opportunity as demand for higher education begins to slip. Some say the future lies in a great unbundling, but in truth, reports of the death of the full-time 3-year degree have probably been greatly exaggerated. So with a new government, a renewed commitment to access and student success, and a regional regeneration agenda, there's an opportunity to build a different vision for a full-time student experience that acknowledges that students are citizens too. They're passengers, clients, patients, employees, voters, parents, volunteers, and taxpayers, each with their own distinct needs and future potential. So as our unique student experience event returns for its 7th year, we'll try to climb out of the doldrums over the student experience debate, asking the question, what would it take for the UK to offer the world's best student experience? We'll get beyond trying to discern the student interest and work towards an ambitious, positive vision for students' participation in higher education. We'll also spend some time interrogating some of the wicked problems associated with particular groups of students in HE. Disabled students, PGR students, students who live locally or less locally to their campus, and the students whose work-based learning means that even the word student, let alone the policy surrounding them, can seem alien. On the day, we'll round up key findings into the student experience from the past year and launch exciting new findings on the student experience beyond the classroom. It's the essential event for anyone working on policy and delivery for students. That's The Secret Life of Students at the Shaw Theatre in London on the 18th of March. We can't wait to see you there. Tickets and more details on Wonkhe.com.
Right, it's been National Apprenticeship Week, and there's been lots of discussion about this on the site and elsewhere. Shitij, walk us through it, please.
Yes, look, if you look at the UK education system from Mars and you look across the entire globe, here is what you see. The amount that we put into school and high school education is pretty good. The amount that we put even into higher education is pretty good. The amount that we put into post-18 options for those who don't go into higher education, and the participation rate, it's kind of plateaued around 41% this week or this year. So it's the 60% who don't go to university in our society. That's where the UK offer, as compared to the other OECD countries, is remarkably lacking. So what we saw in the Apprenticeship Week this year is, opening up of standards to entry into apprenticeship. So it was made a little bit easier because, ironically, we have pretty strict standards of who gets into apprenticeship, when in many ways it is set up as a stream for people who can't go to university and therefore should be more inclusive of that entire set who don't go to university. So I think what has happened is that they've said that instead of a 12-month apprenticeships, you can have 8-month apprenticeships, and the necessity of a certain achievement in English and maths has been relaxed. And the hope is that this would create a rapid infusion of people who could go into the home building sector, the construction industry, and some of the other things that can respond very quickly to an economic stimulus of some kind.
Right. And that's, Jess, also linked, does it, to Labour's plan to remove some level 7 apprenticeships, which some people in the sector are unhappy with, but it does follow the logic, doesn't it, that you need to invest in one versus the other?
Yeah, so one of the things that has been happening over only the last 2 or 3 years is that the average profile of an apprentice has been changing. So they're now more likely to be over 25, studying a sort of advanced or higher level apprenticeship, and a fairly significant portion already have a degree. And so what you're seeing a little bit, if we're being honest about it, is a bit of middle class capture of apprenticeships. And the people who are losing out are, there's a significant decline in apprentices under the age of 19 and under the age of 25, and a significant decline at those lower levels, the sort of sub-degree level apprenticeships. And really what the government has said with the level 7 reform is we have to make a choice. There's not enough money in the levy pot to fund all of this. Again, we don't have any additional money to fund all of it, so we're going to have to make a choice somewhere about the sort of balance of reform here. And they've picked lower level apprenticeships for that. It's probably worth just pointing out two things in this wider debate. So one is that, we ask a lot of polling questions about apprenticeships. They are one of the single most sort of popular branded policy initiatives the government can do across the political spectrum. People love the idea of them. They want there to be more of them. There's a real supply and demand issue. Something like 73% of young people in the Northeast said that they would have considered an apprenticeship rather than applying to university, but they just couldn't find one. They're the availability of them, and they're an employer. It's an employer-led system, right? And some of this is on employers as well as the sort of government incentive side of this. The other thing is to say that, it's not a binary. It's not that people hate universities and love apprenticeships. They sort of love both equally. They have a slight preference for apprenticeships. They still want their kids to consider sort of both options and consider going to universities. There is a real split when it comes to spending. So it sort of links back to our previous discussion. We've got some polling coming out for National Apprenticeships Week this week, which shows that if you rank a list of education priorities, so spending on apprenticeships, spending on schools, spending on childcare, spending on higher education, apprenticeships by far and away are the top, and universities by far and away are the bottom. When you ask the public where they think the government should put this marginal pound that they have, it goes apprenticeships, then childcare, then schools, then universities. And so even, when we're in this sort of making choices environment, we're in this weird world where the government is sort of pulling provision of apprenticeship out of universities, but the public is crying out for sort of further investment and further supply and demand. I'm not quite sure of how we get through that, but I do trust people like David Bell, who's the Vice Chancellor of Sunderland, who this week was announced as the Deputy Chair of Skills England, sort of help us work our way through this and work out what some of the answers are.
I mean, that is a really great appointment, and I think the thing here as well is sort of, because obviously if you look at apprenticeships as a sort of single entity, and then it becomes about, where does the pot go? If you look at this in the context of, I guess, the wider skills landscape, and actually, sort of coming back to that thing, apprenticeships have always been billed to a very large degree as being about expanding opportunity. So, people can get qualified at a higher level, they can earn while they learn. It's a way of learning that might kind of that creates a sort of diversity of options. But they're also about skills and about driving economic growth, and that's where the kind of level 7 picture really comes in, because it's about saying, well, what are the skills that we need in the economy, in different parts of the economy, in different regions, in different industries, and how does offering level 7 work-based qualifications contribute to that? A piece of data that was published in the Times this morning caught my eye as I was kind of coming through for our daily briefing. That there's new evidence that's been released by a group called Oxford Economics that suggests that the return to employers on investing on apprenticeships at level, at sort of management level, it's actually really quite significant. It's like 100 billion or something. And of course, obviously, it depends on the size of the employer. But the thing that is interesting to me there for the sector is about saying, well, then, if the public policy question is what needs to be funded through something like the apprenticeships levy? What could employers be motivated to fund themselves? If there is an ongoing need for investment in that level, that skills level, then that's then apprenticeships have been the answer, but they need not continue to be the answer if that's not where the public policy direction is going. If that makes sense.
It does, and I think again, language here matters. If you go out to the public and say, who is an apprentice, other than the ones who are on TV, they'll generally have in their mind someone who's just graduated from high school or something like that, who is working in a technical sort of a role, learning how to get their first job. Whereas in our new use of the growth in the apprenticeship levy, as you rightly point out, Jess, most of it is being spent. If you to see the two great areas of expenditure are either in sort of the accounting finance area for people to get their accountancy post-graduating qualification, or it's being used essentially to create better managers. Now, traditionally, this expense was seen as a continuous professional development in a company. This was the standard graduate training route when you joined a big corporation. Now, when I've talked to those corporate CEOs, what they tell you is, and there's absolutely no question, if you look at overall expenditure, the amount that big companies, big corporations are spending on staff development in this way had dramatically decreased. And the reasons they give is twofold. One, there are many more small and medium-sized enterprises, as opposed to large corporations who had hundreds and thousands of employees and had their own internal training systems. That's point number one. The second is duration of employment. employment. So previously you invested 2 years of this graduate training for your employee to enhance their potential, and they served you for 10 years. Now the rate of people switching is so more that it is not in the economic interest of a single firm to invest in this because they can't be sure they will reap the rewards of it. So they now see this as a public expense in a way that society should do it for us so that we can compete, so that we can be freed up of making this investment ourselves. So again, I think it goes back to the issue of productivity and growth. Without these trainings, we will not have a more growth-oriented productive economy. But is it the reality of a single firm, or is it essentially a taxpayer's obligation is what it is turning, into? And I don't have an answer. This is a much larger societal choice.
Yeah, I think that's really hit the nail on the head there, right? Is we're asking, what is the taxpayer-funded element of this? And I think bluntly, I would rather see my taxpayer pound going into creating these new opportunity routes, whether it's at level 2, level 3, degree apprenticeships. It's a new role in a company that you can go into as a training route, as a degree apprentice, as an alternative to a standard university degree. What I'm much less enthusiastic about, if I'm being really blunt about it, is that money being used to essentially upskill existing employees, because you're not creating those sort of pathway routes to opportunity.
But you might be creating kind of quite good economic returns, though.
We can't simultaneously have lower corporate tax rates and greater public tax expenditure on increasing the potential of their employees. So we can't, the maths won't add up. So I absolutely get the point that there is an economic return. But then if simultaneously you're going for lower corporate tax rates, then you expect the corporations to pick it up as a part of their expense. So look, it's a complex equation because after all, lower corporate tax rates then become an international competitiveness reality. And Germany is a good example. Germany has traditionally done a lot of what you might say firm-based training. It used to be the holdout example of the success in that arena. You just need to see what's happening there now. So look, some of the fundamentals that we have lived by are changing, is the best one can say.
So that's about it for this week. Remember to go in deep on anything we discussed today. You'll find links to the show notes on Wonkhe.com. Don't forget to subscribe. Just search for The Wonkhe Show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to get ahead of everything that's going on in UKHE, just click subscriptions on the site to find out more. So thanks very much to Shitij, Debbie and Jess, and Michael Salmon, who makes the show happen behind the scenes. We'll be back next week. Jim will be here. Until then, stay wonky.